Hi, everybody. My name is Dr. Lauren Costine. I also go by Dr. Lauren. And welcome. I'm really excited that you're all here today to learn about why affirmative treatment is an imperative component when helping your LGBTQ plus clients achieve long-lasting sobriety and emotional recovery. So we do want to thank our sponsors today, which is Foundations Recovery Network. Thank you, Foundations, for sponsoring this fabulous webinar today. And if you have any questions, you can submit a question at the bottom left of your screen at any point during the presentation. And for resources, you can find a PDF of the presentation resources and additional resources under the headshot image located on the left of your screen. And for any help, please email Melissa Pagaro at mpagaro@naccme.com. To get your NAADACA credit information, you must watch the program all the way through to the end of the presentation. Do not leave the console or you won't get your credit. Please continue to stay on this platform and you will be automatically redirected to an evaluation landing page at the end. If this is your first time attending a webinar in 2019, you will need to create a NACME account when you are first directed to the landing page. For all subsequent webinars you attend, you will already have an account and will just need to log in. After completion of the evaluation, you will be able to download or print your certificates. NADAC credit is only offered for the live broadcast. So on to our presentation today. So I just wanted to tell you a little bit about me, just because it also, not only so you know who I am or my credentials or anything, but it also does inform sort of the lens that I'm bringing this presentation to you, because the LGBTQ plus community is ever evolving, ever changing. There are new developments every day, and it's a very fluid community. There's, young people bringing in new ways of looking at things all the time. So I like to say, well, this is who I am, and I've been doing this for so long. So I am a depth clinical psychologist, also a life coach. My emphasis is in depth psychology, addiction, LGBTQ Affirmative Psychotherapy, women's empowerment with a trauma focus, and I also am trained in EMDR. I've been in the field for 19 years, and I've been sober for over 20 years. I identify as a lesbian, also as femme is my gender expression. I'm cisgender, meaning the gender I was assigned at birth is congruent with who I am. I'm white. I'm middle class, middle-aged, and I grew up in the 70s. So all of this influences the lens I'm bringing to you today. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and I suggest that anyone who wants to be really affirmative with the transgender community, that you also talk about what your pronouns are or have them in your email address. I have it in mine. I'm the co-founder of the LGBT specialization at Antioch University in Los Angeles. It was the first of its kind at the time. And I've been creator of a lot of LGBTQ affirmative programs at treatment centers. I also authored a book called The Lesbian Love Addiction, Understanding the Urge to Merge and How to Heal When Things Go Wrong. And I've had lots of articles written in magazines. I have a private practice in Beverly Hills and Woodland Hills. You can contact me through my website, which is www.drlaurencostine.com. There's a way to email me through there, or you can email me at lauren.costine@gmail.com. I also have an online course for lesbians who are trying to fix their relationship issues. And lastly, a podcast called The Consciousness Salon with my friend and colleague, Alana Roche. And we look at social justice issues from a psychological lens. So those are all the things that I do and that influence how I look at the world. So here is an outline of what we're going to go through today. And we're going to look at what the LGBTQI plus affirmative approach is, and realize that this is a trauma sensitivity training. We're going to look at a little bit of the history of heterosexism and what all the different phobias are and the key LGBTQ plus terms. We're going to look at some gender identity information, multicultural components, and then LGBTQ plus affirmative treatment approaches. So what exactly is LGBTQI plus affirmative psychotherapy? Well, actually, it was developed in the 1970s, a really long time ago, and it focused then just on lesbian and gay folks, mostly gay, which the term was used. The other aspects of the community were basically ignored or really invisible at that time. But it started right around the gay liberation movement. And so we started looking at the fact that if you grew up lesbian or gay, and obviously all the other members of our community, there was some specific and unique needs that needed to be addressed in psychotherapy, and we'll get into all the reasons why, because of our unique issues. And that in the psychotherapy at the time, it was straight identified and cisgender oriented, and really not focusing on our issues, nor really understanding them. And so a lot of folks in the community were not getting treated for certain issues that they needed to be treated for. So later on, they started to acknowledge the bisexual community and then the transgender community, and we're still working on the intersectional components, but a lot more, a lot more is being done regarding the integrating the people of color component as well. And now we've got the identity of non-binary, which we'll be talking about. So as I said, ever evolving, and which is a good thing because it's been very needed. So one of its main objectives, and what I really, really hope that you get today and that you can incorporate in your own work, whether it's private practice or a treatment center, is that it is in part psychoeducational, and it's helping your clients understand how institutionalized and internalized LGBTQ plus phobias, sexism, and multiple oppressions affect your clients so that they can heal. In other words, it's really important to look directly at how we have been affected growing up in a heteronormative community, a cisgender normative community, and world system, and that how this actually has traumatic effects. We look at whether they're big traumas or little traumas, but ultimately at the end of the day, we have to heal the internalization of the messages that are put inside because they create shame, ruptures in the development of the sense of self, ruptures in bonding with other people, or even their parents, depending on, the parents' point of view. It can create big and little T's, as I said, and this is core wounding. So this approach helps heal and build a stronger sense of self, self-esteem, self-worth, self-acceptance, self-love, self-compassion, combat insecurities, help us regulate emotions, empower the observing and the ego, enlighten witness, and how when we're healing these, it helps deal with the traumas and these issues that have contributed to the addictive disorders. So it is completely usable within all different kinds of paradigms. You bring this lens into any kind of modality that you're using here, and you'll see as we go along how you can do that. And so it works with everything, and it's really important too. So I like to bring in a slide of different well-known LGBTQ folks. This is Frida Kahlo, if you don't know who this is, and she was an out bisexual famous artist, in her time, and here we see her wearing a suit, and she was married to a man but had girlfriends, and they had an open marriage. So the different identities, as you can see, I keep doing the different alphabets here. I know most of you by now know that lesbian is women who love women. Gay is the term that most men use for men who love men, have emotional, erotic, sexual, and romantic attraction to men. Bisexual is folks who are attracted to both men and women. And then queer is an identity that embraces all same-sex love, gender identities, and gender expressions as their own. And they feel connected to every identity in the same-sex gender identity and gender variant community. So when someone identifies as queer, they're just saying, I am a part of this community. I'm not specifically saying I am, a gay man attracted only to men. It's like I identify as queer to be a part of the entire community. So pansexual fluids, you may have met those folks who it's someone who loves with the person, falls in love with the person, not because of who or why or how they identify. And asexual is folks who don't have sexual or romantic attraction at all. And they do, I think that is that is a identity and is important to be included. And then questioning. So there are a lot of folks, especially when they're younger, who are questioning who their attraction is or exploring it. And they're not really sure who they fit in. So they might adopt the queer identity. They may just say, I don't know. And this is a really important piece, obviously, to meet them where they are so they can kind of figure out where they're going to land and if they're going to land with an identity or not. There's a fabulous new resource that just came out from the Trevor Project about a coming out manual for LGBTQ plus youth. And I really suggest you have access to that or be able to get access to that for your clients. Here is an older resource, but it still can be helpful if you're wanting to work with your clients to help them understand their sexual attractions. Because instead of saying like attraction is one thing, this is a very sex positive way of looking at it. In other words, it says you may have a sexual attraction, you may have certain kinds of sexual behavior, you may have sexual fantasies, and you may have emotional preferences and social preferences, and you have maybe have different community involvement and then self-identification, and you can put in there what you were like in the past, what's present, what you want ideally. It gives you a lot of different choices so that you can help a client realize that, they may have a sexual identity, but fantasy of other sex or, have fantasies that aren't congruent with their sexual identity or their sexual orientation or their emotional attraction. And it doesn't mean that they're not still lesbian or gay. It's that sexuality is really complex. We're learning more and more about that all the time. And that, we really want to respect that and honor that and allow a safe space in the room with our clients and in our treatment centers so that they can themselves also feel safe to have all this complexity within their own sexual orientation. And it helps ameliorate the shame that they may feel if they're not one way. Because even within the queer community, it can be like, you have to be a certain way. And I think that's really what the movement is doing right now, is trying to stop all of that sort of internal oppression that's going in to the community of like, you need to be a certain way to be accepted. So the The Genderbread Person is a really fabulous resource as well that you can find online, and you can have your clients fill that out. It's a gender identity and gender expression kind of form that you can look at. It gives you various ways of describing how you identify or what you relate to, and in terms of, you know, the sex you were assigned at birth, the gender you were assigned at birth, and who you really are and what you identify with, and the variations within that. So gender identity. So under the transgender umbrella today, we've got quite a few. We've got transgender, and that is a person who transitions from one gender to another from the one that they were assigned at birth. Gender non-binary, a person who does not identify with being male or female or masculine or feminine, and their pronouns that they are used is they or their. And intersex is someone who's born with perhaps ambiguous internal or external genitalia, and historically those babies were turned into girls through surgery, and of course there's a movement now to change that and allow the person to figure out what their gender is on their own as they grow up. So here is another resource that I think is great for you to have to hand out or to have in your treatment groups, and it explains all the different, you know, what gender identity is, what gender queer is, what cisgender is, what transgender is, what non-binary is. And also, for those of you, we'll go over what cisgender is in a moment. I wanted to give a little shout out to Marsha Johnson here, who was part of the Stonewall 50th anniversary. In other words, this year was the Stonewall 50th anniversary, and Marsha P. Johnson was part of the rebellion at Stonewall 50 years ago in the West Village of New York City, when the bar was raided by the police and the riot started, and that started the gay liberation movement. And she was a trans woman, and until recently, her part of the very important tipping point piece of our whole story was ignored. So we're now bringing her story to light, and that's been really helpful. Now, cisgender is when you are aligned with the gender you were assigned at birth. So as I said, I'm cisgender. I was assigned female at birth, and that is, I relate to that. I am aligned with that. That feels right for me. So I have also what's called cisgender privilege, which we'll get into. And so for me, I've moved through the world with this privilege. I don't have to deal with telling people to change my, you know, they've got the wrong pronoun, or being looked at in a shaming way or anything like that. Like, this has been a privilege that I have, and I think it's really important if you identify as cisgender and you're working with this community that you understand that you have that privilege too. Not that you can change it, and not that you can, you know, really ever say, I'm going to totally understand what this is, but use your empathy mind, right? To say, okay, well, I can't completely relate to what it's like to walk around in the world as a transgender person or non-binary, but I can use my empathy to understand that that is something that they have to deal with on a daily basis. So we also live, obviously, in a cis-normative society. Here in California, it's gotten much better. There was a law passed to make sure that the restrooms are gender neutral, that any gender can use the bathrooms to help with the big problem that bathrooms have created. But I know that that's not the case in every state around the country, and this is still a big thing that we're working on. So obviously there's this sexism, as I talked about, which is like, you know, it's kind of a phobia. Cisgender people are given preferential treatment, right, in the world. So what I really think is important to understand when working with this community, know the terminology, know about your own privilege, as I was saying, understand the bathroom situation or other things that they come up against, like pronoun issues, and know that all of this is microaggressions, right? If they are experiencing people not understanding who they are, not respecting who they are, or treating them poorly, or mispronouncing their pronouns even though they know what it is. And that means intentionally, not unintentionally. That those are microaggressions that they're going to be feeling every day that we know can lead to feeling really badly about yourself, being in a lot of internal pain, basically, and then that can lead to the need to medicate, right? Whatever addiction it is, specifically, obviously, substance use disorder. So I've gone through the pronouns. Make sure in your intake, and I know that this is starting to change, but in your policies and procedures, this is really important. Have your intake paperwork be very affirmative. Ask them their sexual orientation, ask them their gender identity, ask them the pronouns that they want to use. This is really important. As I said in my email, I say her, she, her, and hers as just a way of being affirmative and showing that I'm, an ally. Obviously, like I said, the gender-neutral bathrooms are really important. If you can do that in your treatment centers, it's huge. It's really helpful for your transgender clients. And competency. What I mean by that is just really educate yourself. Know what's going on. Know the microaggressions. Know what they're dealing with, and don't assume what a transgender person's sexual orientation is. That also can change. I really suggest that you watch a TV series on Netflix called Tale of the City. It's one of the most trans affirmative shows I've ever seen. It's beautifully done. And I think you can learn a lot also from that. So now we're going to jump to the sexual orientation piece a little bit. So where did all of the problems with shame and discrimination towards sexual orientation begin? Well, it starts with an ideology called heterocentrism, which is the idea that everyone is heterosexual. That's the only normal way to be. Obviously, we have some background with the Old Testament in that as well. And in the Western society, Judeo-Christian society, that's been a big problem. And that leads to something called heterosexism, which is the system that we end up living in. And it's that, obviously it makes sense, right? It's that the system is going to be shaming and discriminatory towards anything that's not heterosexually oriented, the man and the woman and the baby and the white picket fence. And that leads to homophobia, and that's the manifestation. So if we get into this, the bottom line is I really want you to know what Herrick wrote, which is, heterosexism is a worldview, a value system that prizes heterosexuality, assumes it is the only appropriate manifestation of love and sexuality, and devalues homosexuality and all that is not heterosexual. So even though things are getting better, and they really are, and we're seeing that on so many levels, right? It's still the society that we have been raised in, and it's also depending on what area of the country or the world that you have been raised in as well, right? So certain areas are much more progressive, and in those areas, the parents are going to be much more accepting and supportive of their children coming out. And then we've got these other areas that we know of where it's still very oppressed and repressive and dangerous, literally or psychologically. The trans women of color are still being murdered at high rates in certain parts of the country. So, and we still have high suicide rates, and we have very high substance use disorder and other addiction rates. So these messages are still very dangerous and harmful for us. So let's see, who is here? Harvey Milk. He's a really important person. I'm sure most of you have heard of him. I love to put him up here to celebrate his legacy. His main mantra, among many, that was very influential in helping the gay liberation movement was telling everyone to come out so that your family members and your neighbors knew that we existed, because before that, the invisibility was making it seem like we didn't exist, and that was really a big part of the problem. So I'm not going to get too much into this, but there's a large history of homophobia in the Western world. As we know, we've got the Judeo-Christian teachings, which are misogynistically based, and then we've got this, what's called the 7 clobber passages in the Old Testament, like the story of Sodom and Adam and Eve. And then the Christian forefathers were very problematic. They were very heterosexist oriented, they were homophobic, they were misogynistic, and they had a huge influence on Western civilization. And bottom line is, until the mid-1800s, the church, particularly the Christian church, had control over sexuality in general, and viewed sexuality from a moral lens. And there was no understanding of it from a psychological or medical or scientific lens at all. And then in the mid-1800s, scientists started studying it as they got away from so much control of the churches, and we were able to start seeing, the natural elements, the way that it is born this way kind of a idea. And that was really when the movement towards affirming and normalizing and creating space for the LGBTQ plus community started, and is a really important piece of this. So a big part of understanding what's happened and why we've gotten to this place of huge substance use disorders, particularly, and sex addiction and pieces like that, love addiction, is that for many, many years, particularly in the 20th century, the only place that queer people could meet was in bars. It was really the only place. Now, the bars weren't always safe because they were raided a lot by police. That's how Stonewall happened. But at the same time, if it was hidden enough and they weren't bothered by the police, it was where they created community. So community was created around alcohol, and meeting people and creating romantic interest was created through the secrecy of these bars. Also, men in particular were having anonymous sex in parks and bathrooms, and that's because they couldn't have open relationships with each other. So it's just an important piece to know. Another really important piece I'd like you to know from the psychological perspective is that while Freud seemed to have been homophobic, he was actually pretty ambivalent, and he had a lot of empathy towards homosexuality at the time and bisexuality. He actually wrote this very famous letter to a gay man's mother asking her to accept her son. It was the post-Freudians that were much more of a problem, particularly this man named Sandor Rado, who was extremely homophobic, and he was the one that kind of created this hysteria and homophobia within the psychology community, which went through, all the way through after Freud into the 1950s. Conversion therapy started to happen. All these men in particular would go to therapy to try to change their sexual orientation. So would women, or transgender folks would try to change their gender identity, to no avail, and it was extremely traumatizing. So discrimination still exists, as I was saying before, and if you are having a treatment center somewhere in a part of the country that's less affirming or less open to your LGBTQ clients, if you could become affirming yourself, you are going to do so much good. And a big part of that, I said, is through your policies and procedures, understanding the microaggressions, understanding the laws, having gender-neutral bathrooms, really making it clear that you are affirming and that you understand what they've been going through if they've been coming from a very phobic place, and that you're here to create a safe place for them and to help them heal, and that you're going to directly look at their the microaggressions and all of the repression and oppression that they've been dealing with. And also, I want to throw in there the invisibility. So a big microaggression is just feeling invisible, which makes people feel like they don't matter. So it's much more of a little t in that it's not so obvious. It's more nuanced, but the invisibility is really, really, really harmful as well. And we've seen so much of it in pop culture. And so I have a list of shows that you can, have for your clients to look at it. I've found that if we can see ourselves in TV shows and movies and, stories, it's extremely affirming. That's also where the history, her story, their story piece comes into. And when we get educated about how we participated in community and culture over the years, even though it's not in the history books, it's not taught in high school, so on and so forth, it's extremely empowering as well. It's the fact that we grew up in a world that does not value us, that is so harmful, makes coming out really hard, it makes feeling good about yourself really hard. I think you get the point. But the idea is that there's these pieces. There's overt homophobia and transphobia, and then there's covert homophobia and transphobia. So what are these phobias? It's irrational fear and hatred of same-sex love. I put for lesbian phobia, I say it is the irrational fear and hatred of same-sex and emotional erotic love between women, combined with misogyny, which we all know is huge in this society. Biphobia is really real, and people who identify as biphobia experience discrimination within the LGBTQ community. They're pretty invisible. There's a lot of work to change that. Obviously, transphobia and binary phobia, that's all kind of, explanatory. It is, again, the fear and hatred of someone who's transgender or non-binary, and then queer. Multiple oppressions, again, if we combine it with misogyny, or if someone is a person of color, then they have another oppression that they're going to put onto the one they're already dealing with, their sexual orientation. So to please keep that in mind when you're working with your clients. James Baldwin, very famous out gay man, beautiful writer, important person in our community. So let's get to what happens around all of this. You've got kind of the diagnosis. This is the last piece of the diagnosis. It's the idea that we internalize these messages. So we internalize the phobia. We internalize lesbian phobia. We internalize homophobia. We internalize biphobia. We internalize transphobia. What does that mean? Well, you're out there in the world, you're invisible, you're in a very shaming, oppressive, homophobic or transphobic environment. You go to a church that talks about how it's a sin. This is called religious trauma. All of these messages get internalized into the psyche, go deep into the unconscious, into the shadow aspects of our unconscious. We don't even know that they're there, but they come out as symptoms, right? So it's really important to understand that even if you are growing up in a more progressive environment, you can still internalize these messages because they're so systemic and they are microaggressions everywhere. And so you internalize these messages, they go into your unconscious, they go out of your awareness, and then they come out as the symptoms, as I said. And then for some, running towards substances helps you feel better. Sex or love addiction, food, all of the things that we end up dealing with, or you might have a variety of those. Of course, we focus on the substance use disorder first, so that's the tourniquet, right? We've got to stop the bleeding. We've got to stop the person from life-threatening behavior. If the sex addiction is life-threatening, we have to stop that as well. And then we can start looking at the internalization of these messages as a, as a reason why we're medicating, right? So it's really, really important to look at this piece along the treatment, the way you're going to look at their treatment in other ways, from motivational interviewing to cognitive behavioral to 12-step work. This piece, it needs to be addressed as well. As part of the treatment plan, not only, obviously it doesn't replace it, it's part of it, but ignoring it entirely, which I do still see even in Los Angeles, is problematic because I see high relapse rates when this is not addressed in the treatment. And there's a lot of treatment programs that have no idea how to address this. There really needs to be training around this, intensive training around this to get your clinicians on board as well. But what I really want to have you understand today is that if you understand your own biases, if you know your own blind spots, if you get educated as much as you can, you're going to be much more effective. And a really important piece is knowing the internalization. So here we've got Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were said to be extremely close. Elizabeth actually put a picture of Susan B. Anthony in her grave, even though she was married to a man and had many children. Susan B. Anthony never married. She was described as having a manly air when she was written about in newspapers. And just like to look at that from a lesbian lens. Okay, so we have looked at about the effects of it. So the effects of internalized homophobia is this set of negative attitudes incorporated into one's self-image and causes a fragmentation of sexual and affectional facets that interferes with the developmental process. So basically, it interferes with developing a strong sense of self. So studies show that LGBTQ individuals have higher rates of distress. We have higher rates of substance use disorders. We go to therapy more often. It's considered an at-risk group. So it's really, really important. Let's see, we have higher rates, 20 to 30% higher rates. That was back in 2015. Obviously, they'll be doing a study soon again, but at this point, the rates are known to be 20, 25, 30% higher of substance use disorder, needs for therapy, and yet not all of our folks are trained. So that's obviously the problem, and that's why you're here today. So just keep that in mind. There's a lot of folks needing help, but not necessarily getting the right help. AA has been shown through one study, it does not deal with the internalization of the phobias. So that piece is left out. And so I want to jump ahead here because I want to, in our last 20 minutes, get to some of the practices here. So obviously, as I said, really create an affirmative environment, train your staff. Don't ever assume anyone's sexual orientation or gender identity. Ask them, have it in your paperwork so that it's, there for you to know what's going on. Obviously, all about the pronouns. Know the unique stressors that bisexual folks are going through in the community and the transgender community. And just know your own biases, as I was saying before. Really important. Use unconditional positive regard. Get excited about their sexual identity, coming out story, their gender identity, their love life, their life choices. Know about family of choice. A lot of us don't really have supportive family, biological family members. We may have to create our own family. Obviously, the best thing to do is try to create a bridge with their family of origin, if at all possible, in the safest way. And that may take time, but the idea is also that we have the option of having family of choice that can be really helpful. Mirror and normalize their feelings of institutionalized phobias that are out there everywhere. Educate yourself about our culture, learn about our history and their history. know about the books out here, here are a number of books that are very helpful. Some are very helpful for your clients as well to read. Velvet Rage by Alan Downs is really great for gay men. My book called Lesbian Love Addiction is also written for the lay person. It's not just written for clinicians. The Trauma of Growing Up Gay is very helpful. Stone Butch Blues, there's and Beyond Magenta. There's a lot of beautiful books out there for folks. So here is a list of the movies and stories I wanted to tell you about. So we've got, they're out now. And most of these are TV shows, and they're really quite amazing. We've got Tale of the City, as I said before, which is a beautiful show about transgender folks, actually just the queer community in general. You'll notice that they use the word queer throughout as a term that is more popular in the Bay Area of California. Gentleman Jack on HBO is an incredible story about Anne Lister, who was considered the first modern lesbian in England, and her story is amazing. She was beyond brilliant. She was very out, even at a time that was very dangerous, in that she was bold and courageous, and her love for women was really strong, and the show really shows all of the different facets of what she's going through, but it also is extremely lesbian affirmative and is great for your lesbian clients. It also shows a little bit of love addiction, so I think it's good to really understand that piece and educate about it, because she definitely could not be alone, and I think it's an interesting piece to look at from that perspective. The Fosters is a great show about two women fostering children. Obviously, most people know about Will and Grace. So we've got the L Word that's coming out now. There was the first L Word, and it was one of the most important shows to come online on Showtime, as it showed lesbians and bisexual women and queer women as they lived their lives. And it was helpful in the movement that we see today, creating that visibility. They're bringing out a new one this fall called The L Word, The Q Generation, and they're going to try to be more intersectional. I have not seen it yet. I don't know. The biggest criticism was it wasn't enough people of color, and there weren't enough butch women. Most of the women were pretty and femme and things like that, and that was a big problem for more masculine identified lesbians who felt very invisible within the show. And this is an ongoing problem within our community, and that it's something that the community is working really hard on right now, is creating more intersectionality and visibility within our community. And you'll notice when you're working with folks in the community that there is this problem of not feeling completely understood or seen by each other. And I also believe that's the internalization of the phobias, because a lot of that gets projected on to each other as we're trying to figure out ourselves. So I think it's helpful when they know that, and this is a little bit more advanced, obviously, treatment orientation, but when you can get to that place of saying, like, are you taking out some of your stuff on your community members because you're in pain and you haven't healed all of your all of the trauma that you have, and how is that affecting you, and how is that affecting how you are with your friends or your community members? Queer Eye, this fabulous show on Netflix that's just such a feel-good show, and it's really helping with visibility. And we've got a very femme man on there named Jonathan, who's just so fabulous in the community, be called a queen of the highest order. And he's just showing, and they're all showing how diverse the gay men are in the community, and all the different kinds of gender expression, and how fabulous and wonderful that can be. And it's a very affirming show, and it also does beautiful things. One Day at a Time has a lesbian girl on it, Pose with the transgender community. Batwoman just came out with a lesbian lead. It was amazing. Crazy Ex-Girlfriend has a lot of different orientations in there Dear White People, Grace and Frankie, Glee, and Orange is the New Black. So this is really helpful to have your clients watch these shows and then discuss them. So know about Pride Month. I'm sure you do at this point know about Pride Month, but know about what's going on in your local area, see if your center, see if you can get involved, have conversations with your treatment team in regards to your sober living, and find out, how are you going to deal with those challenges, because it's obviously can be very challenging. So, you want to, and I know that a lot of you have come up with issues around what to do if there's a trans person. So if you have a trans person and they're going to be living in your sober living with their, gender identity, and you might have some transphobic folks in your sober living, this is a really important opportunity to educate your clients around transgender identity and sort of explore what their fears or their problems may be, and help them understand that there's nothing to be afraid of, and it's really important that they embrace all your clients and understand that is they are the gender they are saying they are, right? So that's an important piece I know that many of you may deal with. Here is another important lesbian to know about. She was out lesbian of color, Audre Lorde. It is not our differences that divide us. It is our ability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences, which is a perfect saying to what I was talking about regarding what we're dealing with outside in the heteronormative community, and then what we're dealing with inside our own community of challenges with differences, and then how to learn to embrace them, accept them, so on and so forth. So, as I said, create safe spaces, and then really look at your the child development when you get a chance to do that. What was it like in their family system? What was the religious upbringing? Did they experience bullying? Did they have friends? What were the relationships like? What were their parents like? What messages did they hear in the family or in the church or in whatever the religious institution? What messages did they hear? How safe or unsafe was it for them to be themselves? What is their coming out story? This is a really huge passage for us and a lifelong process. So to keep in mind the cultural and religious biases and expectations. In other words, coming out to our family of origin is not always the safest thing to do. And so it's really important to be able to explore with them what that might look like or what that needs to look like at this time. And so things that you can do is gently ask, are you out to your parents? And if not, why? How did your parents react when you did come out to them, if you came out to them? And how are your parents, how do they act about your significant other or your gender identity now? Like really creating space for them to explore this with you. And also to understand that for some of us, we're always coming out. It depends on, the world you live in, how you look, how much internalized homophobia or transphobia you're dealing with still, and to kind of recognize that the process is influenced by all of that. So, and to help create a container, that safe container where they can explore all of this with you and go through the process with you, because it's so, so important and so affirming. And with that, when you help them create that space, they can start finding within themselves what they need to do, start trusting their intuition, start healing the bonds that were broken inside of themselves through the microaggressions, heal the internalized messages and particularly how they may come out in our inner critic, which can be very subtle but also relentless. Mindfulness really helps with getting in touch with the inner critic and seeing what those voices are really saying. And it's really important that they start getting awareness around what the voices inside of them are saying, or if they're externalizing all of their pain. Are they putting it out on others? Are they constantly critical? Are they just, kind of projecting their pain onto others, and then helping them understand that piece. Also figuring out how much support they have, what kind of support they have, if they're ready to be involved with the community or not, and if not, why not? Exploring that. Know the different identity stages. There's a CAST model of homosexual identity development. I've created one that incorporates all the identities. You can find it online, but the first one only dealt with lesbian and gay folks. And there are stages of coming out, and it's really helpful to go over that with your client as well. So also to help them understand the traumatic environment that they've been raised in from a meta level, right? Just the world in general, the system that we're in. The big T's around that, the little T's. What kind of childhood trauma did they have along with being LGBTQ person? When did they start understanding that they may be different? Sometimes it just is a feeling of difference. Some know at 5, I'm gay, and then hide it forever, or I'm trans. Obviously, we're hearing more and more stories of parents that are supporting that. If their child is coming out as trans, of course, we know there's a lot more of trans and LGBT folks that are hiding it, though, right? As I said before, religious trauma. The idea is really important here is that the society that we've grown up in is the problem, right? The messages that we've internalized is not ours. It's not our fault. If there's one thing that you can really do and you can really leave them with is it's not your fault. This is a broken system. It's a dysfunctional system. It's a traumatizing system. You've internalized that. Society has internalized it. And this has made you feel really bad about yourself. It's in part why you feel really bad about yourself. Obviously, as I said before, there's a lot of other factors. How were they parented in other ways? What kind of traumas did they experience early on that didn't have anything to do with their sexual or gender identity? But combining that and realizing it's not your fault, you created defenses to survive, the messages that you were given growing up, and that to actually applaud that resilience, right? To really say, wow, this is amazing that you've come this far and you figured out. You can't tell your parents because they would have done this to you, which you wouldn't have been able to handle, or they may have reacted this way, or they may have kicked you out of the house. So you figured out how to protect yourself. Or if you were kicked out of the house, wow, how you found a place to stay, you found friends, you found a center, you moved to a big city and found their LGBT center and got help that way. How amazing, how resilient you are. So it's to recognize and applaud their strengths, and then do the shadow work of going into and seeing what's really affected how they feel themselves, how they feel about themselves, and why this is a big part of why they're using. And if you come up against a lot of defenses, obviously, from motivational interviewing to only, to just work with that. And in your mind, in your work, you're going to be holding how beautiful it is, how beautiful their identities are, and creating that environment in the room or in the group room. and seek consultation if you're not prepared to work with this. Get your treatment centers training. Have in-training services inside. Really, really get your clients trained if you have these clients in your treatment centers. It is so important because you can do harm without even realizing it, and we know we've taken the oath to do no harm. So, yes, with that, I think it's really important to keep that in mind, and I am available for consultation services. So that's one of the things that I offer. So please reach out to me if that is something that you're interested in. I'd love to work with you. And lastly, I want to leave you with a fun little anecdote here. So this is a picture of Zeus from classical Greece. And classical Greece had a huge influence on the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire had a huge influence on our civilization. So Zeus, by the way, was bisexual. And I don't know if a lot of people know that, but his story is really intense. Actually, he had many lovers. He impregnated a lot of women, but he also had a male lover that he was very close to and loved very deeply. And it's written about in their literature. And if we look at him, we see that the sort of strong man with curly beard and long hair that seems very powerful and strong, that is a archetype that has lasted through our society and influences us today, and yet we don't know that he was bisexual. So I wanted to end on that, and if you're also interested in learning more about our history and their story, that's a huge part of the consultation I do too. I created a whole class on it at Antioch, and it's one of my favorite things to teach about. I also have a lot of resources here for you to, a lot to look up. Very much for the clinician, most of it though. All right, so that concludes our presentation today. I hope you enjoyed it and it kept you stimulated and interested. This is something I'm extremely passionate about and I love, and it's my honor and joy to present it to you. And don't forget to reach out to me if you would like to bring me into your treatment center for more consultation. I would be happy to work with you. It would be my pleasure. And thank you so much for joining today.